So good afternoon. Welcome to this week's Pride Talks History. This series is a collaboration between the Little Museum of Dublin, EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum, the National Library of Ireland, and the Museum of Literature Ireland. This series is being presented in association with the Dublin LGBTQ+ Pride. Now, today we're going to be joined by Fiona Brennan from the Little Museum of Dublin with a talk titled Queer Dublin. Now, Fiona is the host of the Queer Dublin tour in the Little Museum, which was created with the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. Now, one important aspect of the lives of many Irish heroes has been that their queerness has been airbrushed out of Irish history. And in today's talk, Fiona will chart some of the societal changes of the 20th century using a discussion of some of the key artefacts on display within the Little Museum's collection. Now I give you your host for today, Fiona Brennan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for the intro, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm going to cover a few topics in our short talk today, and I'm sure some of the people joining us today will be quite familiar with some of the characters that we speak about, but we might also discover a person or even a place that we didn't necessarily know was a part of the story of Queer Dublin. And that's really a part of the essence of Pride, I think. The Pride Festival gives us a chance to reflect and celebrate our queer history, which has sometimes been overlooked. And I'll just briefly say as well that next week, we're going to be getting back together with the other panelists in our Pride Talks History series. And we're going to have a bit of a reflective panel discussion next week. So if anyone has any questions or comments, or if you want to send us in your own story, please do join us next week for that. And do send in your comments and questions to me here today into the chat, and we'll go through it at the end. But now we're going to start with an event which is probably quite familiar with some of the people joining us today. In 1916, as we know, there was a revolution here in Ireland. But what might be a little bit less apparent was the fact that many of the most important figures who took part in the Easter Rising were in fact queer. And one of the most prominent examples would be Elizabeth O'Farrell, who took part in the 1916 Easter Rising as a nurse. Now, at the end of the Easter Rising, the only participants left in the General Post Office garrison were the rebel leaders, Elizabeth O'Farrell and her lifelong partner, Julia Grennan. And the rebel leaders chose O'Farrell to go alone into the battlefield to deliver a notice of surrender to the British soldiers, and Elizabeth O'Farrell had nothing but a white flag to protect her. A photographer captured the iconic moment of the surrender. So in the photo you can see on your screen here, it's the moment that Porrick Pierce and Elizabeth O'Farrell surrendered to British soldiers in British HQ. A photographer captured this iconic moment, and the original photograph is on the left of your screen. The photograph on your right was published in an English tabloid after the Easter Rising, and you can see that O'Farrell is absent from the published image despite being visible in the original photo. So the tabloid quite literally airbrushed Elizabeth O'Farrell out of history. And this is just one example of a queer person being erased from our history. As iconic as this image is today, the fact that O'Farrell was a lesbian and Pierce was probably queer is rarely mentioned. So the queerness of these two Irish heroes was airbrushed out of our history. And that's perhaps another reason why the Pride Festival is so important to us. It helps to solve this problem. It gives us a chance to reflect on our story and paint these important figures back into our history. And staying with the Easter Rising for another moment, I'm sure many people will know that Countess Markievicz took part in the fighting during the Easter Rising here in Dublin. But I really want to talk about her sister, Eva Gore-Booth, who is better known as a poet. In the image you can see here, we see Eva Gore-Booth and her lifelong partner, Esther Roper. And Eva and Esther actually turned up in another talk, a previous talk in our Pride Talks History series. So I think the pair are becoming a little bit more well-known, thankfully. But in 1916, Eva Gore-Booth, her partner Esther Roper, and a trans woman called Irene Clyde, they founded a magazine called Urania. And Urania means genderqueer. They published articles on trans issues, and incredibly for the time, they advocated for a genderless society. And this is remarkable in 1916. In that society, at that time, being trans was considered a disorder. And it's kind of striking that, in a way, their campaign of awareness is continuing even to this day, as trans people can battle against workplace discrimination, lack of healthcare, and sometimes even violence. The Trans Equality Network Ireland, or TENI, has lots of info about that on their Facebook page, including a powerful address that Lilith Ferreira Carroll gave last Saturday on this very subject for the Pride Online Festival. So definitely worth checking out again. But back to Eva and her partner. After all their good work and a long and happy life together, Eva and Esther were buried together in the same grave with a quote from lesbian icon Sappho carved on their gravestone. And I think that might have just been a way of keeping the future historians from referring to them as gal pals. But it's not only historical figures that I want to highlight in our talk today. In the story of queer Dublin and in Dublin's history, there have also been some queer spaces that are vital to our story. And one of the first gay-friendly bars in the city was called Rice's, and that was where the Stephen's Green shopping centre is today. And there was another gay-friendly bar at the end of that street called Bartley Dunn's. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, there wasn't anywhere for queer women or trans people to socialise, and I'm sure that won't really come as a shock to anyone listening today, but at least gay men could meet up in Rice's or Bartley Dunn's if they knew about them. So the friendliness of these bars was only really known through word of mouth. And of course, you weren't going to see an advertisement for these two queer spaces. But a journalist in the 70s recorded that back in the days, young and not so young men would go to the Hirschfield Centre nervously asking for info. And then a few weeks later, you might see them sipping a drink in the corner of Bartley Dunn's or Bobby Rice's. So that description of this tentative first step into a queer space, that sounds a little bit familiar. I think that even happens to this day. But Bartley Dunn's was very close to Rice's on King Street, and Senator David Norris spent a lot of time in Bartley Dunn's. And David Norris is one of the great heroes of our story. For those who may not be familiar, David Norris brought the Irish government to court for denying our human rights, and he set up the first queer community centre here in Dublin also. So we're going to talk about him a little bit more later on. But for now, David Norris paints a picture of queer socialising in Dublin in the 1960s. He remembers this about Bartley Dunn's. It was an Aladdin's cave. Its wicker-clad Chianti bottles, heavy scarlet velvet drapes, and an immense collection of multicoloured bottles of liqueur glinting away in their bottles. And Senator Norris also recalls how Bartley Dunn was filled with theatrical old queens and there was only one song on the sound system, No Je ne regrette rien by Edith Piaf. So I think this shows that this tiny Dublin queer scene was full of glamour, music, and fun. And I think that shows that finding and celebrating our community was as important back in the 1960s as it is to this day. And these days, of course, it's much easier to find queer spaces in which to socialize in the city. You don't have to go underground at all. It doesn't have to be by word of mouth. At the moment, the rainbow flags are literally everywhere in the city. You have, of course, the George, Dublin's oldest queer nightclub, Street 66, which some people might remember as the Front Lounge, and of course, Panty Bar, which is run by the Queen of Ireland herself on Capel Street. And I said this the last time that I gave a short talk on queer history, but again, hopefully we'll find ourselves back in our usual haunts fairly soon. I always like to speak about these pubs in order to highlight the importance of dedicated queer spaces to our community, because they are a break from a heteronormative society. There's a very interesting Irish YouTuber called The Liberal Cook, and in one of their videos, they posited this idea that celebrating our queerness is an act of protest. Celebrating our queerness is an act of protest. And I think that's a particularly powerful sentiment, especially now during Pride. I really think it's important for our community to celebrate together. And I'm sure that we're all looking forward to hanging out safely together in the very near future. And speaking of legendary queer spaces, no talk on the story of queer Dublin would be complete without mentioning the Hirschfield Centre in Temple Bar. So the Hirschfield Centre is quite famous as the first dedicated queer space in Dublin. So the first dedicated queer meeting space in the city. And we actually have the original brass plaque, which hung outside the venue in the Little Museum of Dublin. And in my totally biased opinion, it is the most important item in our collection. It's certainly one of my favourites anyway. The centre was named after Dr. Magnus Hirschfield, who was one of the first gay rights advocates in the world. And the Hirschfield Centre had a cinema, a cafe, and I think most importantly, it had a disco called Flickers. And flicker is Dutch slang for homosexual, not unlike another F word in the English language. So with the naming of the Flickers disco, the queer community was reclaiming prejudice language which had once been used against them. So again, another example of the celebration of queerness as an act of protest. Senator David Norris, who we mentioned earlier, founded and largely funded the Hirschfield Centre. And he was working in the disco one night when a young man came in. And the young man's entourage were carrying bottles of orange juice and a magnum of champagne. David Norris asked this character if he had his membership card with him, and the young man did not, because he turned out to be Elton John. So he must have left his ID in one of his other fabulous outfits. So as you can see, even though the Flickers disco was very much an underground queer space, it still managed to attract famous and very glamorous clientele. Now, the Hirschfield Centre was located down a dark, dingy alleyway called Found Street in Temple Bar, and this was to allow members to enter without being seen. But this did not prevent attacks on the building itself. One night in 1985, Senator Norris found the makings of a bomb on the roof of the Hirschfield Centre, but he called the guards and the disco went ahead. However, 2 years later, the centre really did go up in flames, destroying the building. And Senator Norris was there that night, as well. A horrified member could not believe Norris's calmness in the face of the destruction of the building. And David Norris told him, "Can a man not enjoy his own fire?" But this was the end, unfortunately, of the Hirschfield Centre, because funding was not granted to restore the building. And throughout all of this, Senator Norris was challenging anti-homosexuality laws in Ireland, and he brought his argument to the European Court of Human Rights, and the court finally found in Senator Norris's favour in 1988, but it would be a further 5 years before the laws would be repealed by the Irish government, who did not consider it a priority. Senator Norris's senior counsel throughout his legal battles was Mary Robinson, who had worked for homosexual law reform in Ireland since the 1980s. And the image on screen now is her campaign poster from 1990, when she became the first female president of Ireland. And I think it's quite fitting that it was Mary Robinson who, as president, signed the bill decriminalising homosexuality in 1993. And of course, I think it's fair to say that 1993 ended up being kind of a turning point in our queer history, and certainly in the story of queer Dublin. And we really can't stress enough the importance of David Norris's work to our history. But activism does come in many forms, not just in challenges to anti-homosexuality laws in the courts. For example, I'm sure few among us will recognise this character, Tom McGinty, better known as the Diceman. When the Diceman moved to Dublin in 1976, he was employed to advertise shops by wearing eye-catching costumes. Now, it was illegal to loiter on Grafton Street, so the Diceman moved at this slow, glacial pace up and down Grafton Street, carrying his signs and his advertisements. But this job had unique hazards. Tom himself once said, apart from the kicking, punching, burning, and other unmentionable things, people stand there discussing the hairs in your nose and whether the beer belly is a cushion or an advanced pregnancy. But aside from being great fun, the Diceman was also a human rights activist. The Diceman referenced the tragic murder of Declan Flynn in a famous protest outside the Dáil in 1988. He wore this bloody costume and he was carrying a sign which read, "What's another queer? Murdered men and suspended sentences." And just to mention briefly that the heartbreaking murder of Declan Flynn led to a large protest march in 1983. And this in itself was a catalyst for future protest/pride marches. And it would eventually evolve into the celebratory Pride Festival that we see today. So it wasn't the first Pride March in Dublin's history, but it was indeed significant. The Diceman was among the first LGBTQ activists who helped make Ireland a more tolerant country. And our most famous drag queen, Miss Panty, has said that seeing the Diceman on Grafton Street when she was young inspired her. And at the Diceman exhibition in the Little Museum last year, Miss Panty was actually our keynote speaker. And she said that she thought Tom would have been proud of how far Ireland had come. And in fact, I don't think we'd even have Miss Panty and her other fabulous drag artists without the Diceman. So he is truly a Dublin legend. And Miss Panty herself is another Dublin queer icon who went on to become a somewhat accidental activist. In 2015, after being censored on Irish television, Panty made a speech known as the Noble Call in the Abbey Theatre to raise awareness of discrimination. And the video of the speech went viral all over the world, and it spread Panty's message all over the world. So actually, the attempt to silence her led to her speech becoming famous and globally celebrated by icons such as RuPaul and Madonna. And this is why Miss Panty also responds to the title of Queen of Ireland. This photo always makes me smile when I see it. I think the Diceman and Miss Panty are both really vital to our story of queer Dublin, because they really highlight the importance of positive media representation for our community. And again, this idea of celebration as an act of protest for the queer community. So everybody in Dublin, and even outside of Dublin, everybody knew the Diceman, and Miss Panty now is a global icon. The pair are wonderful examples of both strong media representation for our community, and they are both quintessential Dublin characters. Although I will hasten to add that Miss Panty is in fact a proud country girl from County Mayo, but that doesn't stop her from being a Dublin icon as well. And that's why both Panty and the Diceman are a huge part of our story of queer Dublin. So now we've done a really quick overview of a few figures who were important historically, and also a few more recent public figures and activists who got our community to where it is today. And happily, I think I can say that our community is in a pretty good place today. For example, we saw the enormous activism for the 2015 marriage equality referendum. And that referendum, of course, passed with a with a majority of 62%, making Ireland the first country to legalise same-sex marriage by a popular vote. But also in 2015, the Gender Recognition Act was passed, and this gave trans people, it allowed them to have legal recognition of their gender. Before this, trans people could have been denied services or access to travel because their official documents were considered incorrect. So the new laws from 2015 also protect trans people from being outed at work, and so can also help to prevent discrimination. Now, Dr. Lydia Foy had been campaigning for these rights for years, and she is another great hero of the story of queer Dublin. In 1992, Dr. Foy had sex reassignment surgery, which led to a 24-year battle to have her identity, her gender identity, recognised by the Irish government. And Ireland finally agreed with the European Convention on Human Rights and changed Dr. Foy's birth certificate. So her successful campaign acted as a catalyst to have these rights set down in law in 2015. So we have Dr. Foy and countless other fierce activists and campaigners to thank for this great improvement to queer rights in 2015. And a lot has changed since then as well. In 2018, Leo Varadler became the first openly gay Taoiseach of Ireland, and this made him the fourth openly gay head of state in the world. And perhaps quite tellingly, when Leo came out publicly in 2015, Miss Panty immediately invited Leo to the pub. So that was perhaps his tentative inauguration into the community. And I think that might be a good story to end on, because it kind of demonstrates where we are today. When someone comes out as queer in Ireland today, it's actually a bit of a cause for a bit of a celebration. And it's an excuse for us to kind of, again, celebrate queerness, and in itself, using that celebration as an act of protest. And I think Pride is a great time for us to celebrate and acknowledge how far we've come as a society. And just to mention briefly as well, that I run the Queer History of Dublin tour in the Little Museum. So when we're able to host our tours again, I do hope some of you will join us for that. I covered a few topics in our short discussion today, but there really is so much more to talk about. There's so many more stories to tell. So I hope you will be able to join us in future for that. But for now, I think perhaps I've done enough talking just for the moment. We have a little bit of time left for a Q&A. If anyone wants to ask a question or leave a comment or tell us your own story, please do put it in the chat there and we'll get to it. I think my colleague Sarah had fielded a few questions for me now.
Yes, indeed. Fiona, thank you so much for that. There's a few people who have written into the comments, just leaving a few of their own personal reflections and experiences. One attendee remembers drinking in Rice's before emigrating to London in 1983. And that same individual was saying that they were one of the first 3 people who published Ireland's first publicly sold LGBTQ magazine, Hermes. And so we have someone who's just written in to say, is it possible to access any of the materials from Urania? Do we know where Source's material is?
Yeah, it was a little bit hard to find copies, unfortunately. But the Glasgow Women's Library is where I got my photo that I shared in the slideshow there. So the Glasgow Women's Library, if you look up their website, you might be able to access some of the copies via that.
Amazing, thank you. And I know from the Little Museums context, and I think this week is quite unique for me in that I'm getting to speak to one of my colleagues rather than one of our neighbouring attractions. I remember that we were particularly delighted when you turned around and decided to take ownership of actually creating this tour for the museum, kind of an intelligent use of one of the lockdowns that we found ourselves facing into last year. And one thing I don't think I ever actually asked you was what the experience of writing this tour was like in terms of the scale of the archives and, how readily available material was to inform your research and just what the experience was like overall.
Yeah, let me cast my memory back to a year ago when I spent 3 months in lockdown just focusing on the research and getting it written. The artifacts in our main collection that I speak about on the Queer History Tour, they were already there in the main collection. They were all just hanging on the wall, readily available for me to speak about, which was really great. For me, then, it was just a matter of linking the story together, perhaps linking the artifacts together in maybe a coherent way for an audience. And perhaps in some cases, maybe finding the story that was sort of behind the artifact, maybe in a way. Like, for example, the photograph of Elizabeth O'Farrell, that's been hanging on our wall for quite a few years now. But through my research, I kind of clocked that she was a part of our queer history. That photo was readily available for me to speak about. And the story that we were telling about Elizabeth O'Farrell being kind of deleted from that photograph, there was a really easy kind of short link between that. Like, okay, it's about maybe you could say it's about the erasure of women from history, and it's a really short step to the erasure of queer people from history as well. So that's just one example, but yeah, the artifacts were really just available for me in the collection. It was wonderful to see from my point of view. And then there are lots of historians working at the moment on going through our archives, all of our country's archives, and I guess just looking again at these historical figures and the artifacts that we already have, and maybe viewing them through a slightly new lens, just maybe being a little bit more open than historians might have been in the past to the possibility that these figures may have in fact been queer, and just being open to exploring that. And yeah, the proof is often right there once we allow ourselves to look for it and go for it.
I think that's an interesting challenge and opportunities that kind of we as keepers of collections have to actually look at the better understanding the stories that we have the opportunity to tell. And I think we're really proud that this is a story that you're enabling the museum to tell. One thing that Dr. Lydia Foy, a really inspiring story to kind of read about, but I kind of wonder, because we're talking today as part of the Pride Festival, do we know much about Dr. Foy's involvement in Pride?
Yeah, well, Dr. Lydia Foy was the Grand Marshal of the Dublin Pride Parade. I believe that was in 2010.
Okay.
That was actually something I discovered in an exhibition just beside us in the Stephen's Green Shopping Centre. It's a wonderful exhibition. There's a part of it that charts the history of the Dublin Pride Parade itself. So it's open for another few weeks as well if anyone wants to check that out. But yeah, Dr. Lydia Foy was the Grand Marshal of the Dublin Parade itself. I also recently I found the video of her giving the public address as the Grand Marshal in that year, and you can find that quite easily online as well. It's a wonderful speech. It's full of humor. She actually does an impression of Senator David Norris, who is sitting on the podium right beside her. So Dr. Foy seems like a very light-hearted and humorous person, as well as being a fantastic campaigner, a person who campaigned for over 20 years for the rights of trans people in Ireland. So a great hero of the community, and it's great to see a person like that still able to retain so much humor and so much grace after such a long fight. And just another person that springs to mind as well, just as I'm speaking about that, another great trans rights campaigner was also a Grand Marshal only a few years ago, and that was Sarah Phillips, who's the chairperson of TENI as well. So there have been a few people in that wonderful community who have been heavily involved in Dublin Pride also. They get to lead the parade as well.
And hopefully next year we'll be back to physical, in-person moments and kind of opportunities to, lead from the front once again. But I found this series really insightful and fascinating. And one name that I noticed cropping up over the course of talks that we've experienced in the last couple of weeks was that of Eva Gore Booth. And I'm kind of wondering, is there a particular reason why her prominence is so kind of recurring within these talks?
Yeah, I noticed that myself in a couple of our other talks in the series. I'm not really aware if she would have an anniversary at the moment that's making her a little bit more prominent just at the moment. My opinion on that might be that, well, she's a very famous sister, of course, Countess Markievicz. And because we're in the decade of centenaries, I think it has encouraged people to kind of look back on our history, but also while we're celebrating our centenaries, we're kind of reflecting in a new way and perhaps in a more sensitive way, which I think is wonderful. And we're kind of again looking at sort of the story behind the huge public figure, or the story behind the artifact, or maybe the human side of this enormous public historical figure that we all know about. So what's interesting is in 1916, the two sisters were fighting their own revolutions, two very different revolutions, and Countess Markiewicz's revolution would be the more prominent and the more famous one. But what's interesting about Eva Gore Booth's campaign of awareness, which she was carrying out through publishing Urania, what's interesting about that is her fight isn't over yet. That revolution is still in a way ongoing. Countess Markovic, you could say maybe she won her fight after a week after the Easter Rising was over. You could say that it was kind of, it was a short and a larger kind of burst of this activism and energy. But with Eva Gore-Booth's campaign, I think it's still ongoing. So yeah, in a way that will keep it in people's mind, I think, even to this day. Yeah, which I think is a good thing, definitely.
Yeah, and I do think it's kind of this layering effect of working towards a goal over generations, and the idea that, you know, it's not that there's a 1 week quick fix, and that, you know, it's we are suddenly the end goal of the most desirable form of a community that we wish to become. You know, it doesn't happen overnight, and I think that's one of the unique opportunities that we as history focused institutions have to actually have these conversations about where, you know, what we've achieved in the past in looking towards where we're going in the future. And I guess my kind of the last question that I'm going to choose a question of my own as the last one, if you don't mind. You mentioned that the Hirschfeld plaque has particularly strong kind of resonance to yourself, and that would be in, you know, your own personal highlight within the Little Museum's collection. And I know, you know, biased as it may be, we all definitely have our own. When you were going through the research, and when you're exploring the Little Museum's collection, what's the one story, or what's the one, I guess, yeah, it is story or artifact that has stuck with you most? Like, what's the story that you are proudest to tell?
It would actually be the Urania story.
Okay.
I do find that so fascinating. Yeah, when people ask me that question, sometimes I go into the whole spiel about Eva Gore-Booth again and Urania. Maybe that's why she's come to prominence. I've just been talking about it so much that people are picking up on it. Let me think about that for 1 second, and I'll choose another artifact. There is a T-shirt on the wall in our main collection, and it's boxed up. For a long time I actually thought it was a poster, but it is in fact a T-shirt, and it's for the Gay Switchboard. And it says gay rights across the chest, and then there's a photograph of the telephone, the old-fashioned kind of rotary telephone, and it was being used to advertise the Gay Switchboard, which was kind of like a helpline throughout the 1970s and onwards for the community. It provided information and advice and resources. And I just find that such a wonderful artifact, because it's an artifact now and it's kind of stationary and static on our wall. But back in the day, back in the 70s, someone was wearing that on their bodies all over Dublin. They were walking around town with the word gay written across their chest in the 1970s. That's no small thing. And I just found that kind of brave. And where today, happily in Dublin in the last month, there have been rainbow flags everywhere. And you can buy yourself a T-shirt that has the new Dublin Pride Festival flag on it, and you can wear that all over town. But back in the 70s, to do so with this kind of like advertising T-shirt, I found that incredibly brave. And it was a lovely moment for me to discover that it's not just an artifact in the museum. It was a worn thing. It was a living thing. So I do love that artifact. That's here in our main collection if anyone wants to pop in and see what I'm talking about.
Amazing. And I think on government advice, hopefully sooner than later, we'll be reopening guided tours, and you'll be able to launch the tour and start welcoming people back in to tell these stories in person as well.
Hopefully.
Yeah, well, hopefully sooner than later. Brilliant. Well, then next week we're going to sit down with Fiona and with each of our past speakers as well, and just take a little bit of time to reflect on some of the key themes and stories that we've told over the course of the last 4 weeks as part of this series. But for now, I think that brings us to the end of today's conversation. Fiona, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and with your stories. It was really a fascinating, insightful way to spend an hour.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for the lovely comments and questions there. I'll look forward to reading through those later on when I get a chance.
Brilliant. So that's it for another week of Pride Talks History, which is a collaboration between the Little Museum of Dublin, EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum, the National Library of Ireland, and Molly, the Museum of Literature Ireland. This series is being presented in association with the Dublin LGBTQ+ Pride